Rockefeller was the wealthiest capitalist that the world had ever seen. I mean, this guy had money coming out of his ears. He was ruthless in business, shut down his competitors, whatever he had to do. This guy had so much money he could never spend it in 10 lifetimes. And a lot of it he plowed into education. And the guy he put in charge of his operation, Frederick Gates, unbelievably said the quiet part out loud. He said, look, we don't need to train up, artists and lawyers and politicians and statesmen. And, we need workers. We need workers. Right? And so the education needs to be focused on creating workers for us. He wanted complacent, unthinking worker drones to sit in the factory and turn the screwdriver when the widget came across, and not think about the important things in life, not think about politics, not think about whether this was a reasonable system.
Your organization is known worldwide, and we certainly appreciate every facet that you do.
I do believe in what you're doing because I've seen it in my family.
I'm so excited about all the things that, Robert, you guys do with Classical Conversations. It's been a huge blessing for our family.
Grateful for the work at Classical Conversations. You're a leader, and you have been in this movement for a long time.
We love Classical Conversations.
I do feel like I have a debt of gratitude to you, your family, all of CC for just the fruit that has come from CC.
I appreciate all that you guys do, both through this wonderful podcast and also through Classical Conversations, which I am convinced is the best education resource out there. Thank you very much for all that you do for the cause of Christ and for our families and for our children. Really, really appreciate it.
Hey everyone, and welcome to another exciting episode of Refining Rhetoric. We are in School Choice Week 2026. If you haven't checked it out, go watch the 2025 series. That actually inspired me to reach out to Alex Newman, who I'm interviewing today to write our new book, Woke and Weaponized, How Karl Marx Won the Battle for American Education and How We Can Win It Back. Alex is a homeschool dad, a researcher, a journalist, a writer, all around a great human being, of course. And Alex, welcome to the show.
Great to be here. Thanks very much, Robert. And of course, I'm a CC dad, not just any homeschool dad. So,
yeah, no, absolutely. We love our Classical Conversations dad. They're like other dads, just a little bit smarter. No,
right. Make better choices about their kids.
Yeah. No, we don't want to alienate any of our audience. We're happy that any dad is focused and involved in his child's life. And I think after reading this book, this is for dads, this is for moms. It's especially for pastors. I think pastors need a copy of this, and for our legislators as well, because if we don't know where our ideas came from, if they're not built on a rock that's solid, instead it's built on some shifting sands, in my mind, we're just wasting a lot of our own time, resources, and treasures the Lord's given us. And so, this book, I believe, is going to open up a lot of eyes into understanding what's actually going on. Because if you don't know the root cause of a problem, it's going to be very hard to do anything other than just solve symptoms as they pop up. So thanks for writing the book with me, Alex.
It was an honor and a pleasure. Thanks very much, Robert.
What was your first thought, as I kind of pitched this idea to you, Why did you say yes, and what were you hoping that this book would do for the listeners?
Well, for me, it was almost a bit of divine providence, Robert, because as you know, I've written 2 books already on education, and I consider the subject matter incredibly important. In fact, I can't think of any subject as important as education. I almost sound like a broken record because I'm always telling people that's the issue that really matters. Mm-hmm. And so the first book and the second book were important, but they didn't cover a very important element of the most important subject that we could be dealing with, and that is the school choice issue, which, of course, we deal with extensively in the book. And so when you reached out and suggested that we work on this project, I was like, yep, that would be perfect. It's desperately needed. Nobody else has done this, right? And I didn't want to do it. I kind of avoided doing it in the first 2 books. I understand, we both realize, Robert, that this is very controversial, even among our friends, even among, people who we love dearly, legislators that we've known for years, are on the wrong side of this, but it had to be done. And so when you reached out and asked if I'd be willing to do this, I thought, yep, it's a sign. It needs to be done, and here's the chance to do it well.
Yeah, we certainly didn't write this book to become popular.
Right. No.
All right. So there's a couple things like today. I just wanted to, as we wrote this book together, got outside authors, did our research. There's just some things that stood out to me, and I wanted to give some flavor, a insight into some of the things that we talk about in the book with teasing what's in there. And so one of the first things I thought about, as you write a book, like who's going to write the prologue, who's going to introduce it to the audience. And so I reached out to Dr. Benjamin Merkel from New St. Andrews College. They do not take federal loans. Hillsdale also doesn't take federal loans, but they, for some reason, got confused when they got to the charter schools, and they have these charter schools taking state money left and right. So, but Benjamin Merkel with New St. Andrews, he was willing to do it. They're on the straight and narrow, and he writes this: over the past 40 years, the classical Christian education movement, both in institutional schools and in the homeschooling families that have adopted the model, has easily been the single biggest cultural victory for the American evangelical church. Therefore, it should not surprise us that forces would align to target and gain control of this movement. If we want to continue gaining ground in the world of education, it is imperative that we do not hand control of what we have built at the K-12 level over to secular authority. And we must understand that funding is authority. So, yeah, what is your take, especially on that last sentence, that understanding that funding is authority, and why do you agree with that or disagree with it, and why is that an important statement?
Robert, this is a lesson I learned as early as I can remember. Like, some of my earliest memories of life lessons learned was my dad saying things like, "He who pays the piper calls the tune," or one of his favorite lines was, "With federal aid comes federal control." And he would say that to me because I'd say, "Dad, can I go do this? Can I go out and do this? Can I meet with these people?" No. Well, why not? Well, because with federal aid comes federal control. I pay your bills, you live in my house, I buy your food, and therefore you must do what I say. So for me, this was not like a big leap to figure out, oh, if the government's giving me the money to homeschool, the government's going to expect to be able to control my homeschooling. So Dr. Merkel is 100% correct. And conservatives used to understand this very, very well. Who could forget Ronald Reagan warning us about the 9 most terrifying words in the English language? I'm from the government and I'm here to help. You should run in the opposite direction. But he's absolutely right. With the funding comes authority, comes control. And as good conservatives, you almost can't make an argument against that. Do you really want your money going to people with no accountability? What if they waste it? What if they spend it teaching their kids jihad? What if they spend it taking field trips to Paris? We all want sensible controls and accountability when it comes to the use of tax money. Here in Florida, we're dealing with this issue right now. A bunch of private schools owned by the Chinese Communist Party, a bunch of private schools owned by Islamic groups are taking our money, tax money, using it to brainwash kids, making a fortune doing it. And now everybody's having that awkward conversation of like, well, we told them there wasn't going to be controls when we passed this, but now they're using it to brainwash kids with crazy stuff. What do we do? And so this is really awkward for these people. But Dr. Merkel's exactly right.
Yeah, and he should know because he's in the higher ed space, and the federal government's been, and government in general has been funding it for decades, and the costs are sky high, and the quality is very low. So it's not surprising that they're trying to do the same thing in K through 12 education. And this is the part that kind of blew my mind because we've done a lot of research. And I was counting the pages today, and I might be off by 1 or 2, but I think we have 18 notes of pages. So well-researched. This isn't stuff that like you and I, obviously there's a lot of our opinion or conclusions drawn from the research in the book, but it's wild that this isn't happened by accident. And so chapter 1, one of the chapters you primarily authored said, this is an excerpt from that. Robert Owen, which is a name not many people are familiar with, but they will be after they read our book. He founded a collective commune in New Harmony in Indiana, and his goal was to raise a generation freed from religion, tradition, and private property. And in 1826, he said, a trinity of the most monstrous evils that could be combined to inflict mental and physical evil upon this whole race. And that trinity of evil, he said, was basically private property, Christianity or religion, and marriage. And, after the commune collapsed within a couple of years, he realized that it was because the children had not been conditioned yet for commune life, and therefore we needed the public school system. So you did the primary research on this chapter, Alex. Like, what did you know about Robert Owen beforehand, and why is he such a shadow figure in where we are today in American education?
Yeah, for me, this is one of the most interesting stories ever. Right? This, for me, is one of the most important pieces of human history, and yet virtually nobody knows it. And so I first got my first clue about Robert Owen in a book by Dr. Samuel Blumenfeld. This is a man who spent literally 60 years of his life focused on the education issue. He wrote 12 books on education. He had a doctorate degree. He literally devoted his life to this issue. And so I co-wrote a book back in 2014 with him, and he kind of became my mentor on education issues. And one of the first things I did was buy every book that he ever wrote on education, and that helped me a lot. And he had just a kind of a throwaway line in one of his books about this guy, Robert Owen, who had inspired the Prussians, who had inspired Horace Mann. And I thought, man, that seems like an important clue. So I started digging into Robert Owen. And every time I dug, I found more and more craziness. So the last book I wrote, I knew some about him. I knew he was a socialist. I dug into his autobiography, and he was very proud of the role he played in shaping the Prussian system, which again was the model that was eventually imported to the United States. And then for this book, I said, we got to go even deeper. I had been talking to an educator. He's got a wonderful newsletter, Dan Murphy, and he was digging into some of the primary source documents as well. So we're calling each other and comparing notes, and he stumbled on some really interesting speeches that Robert Owen had given. I started looking into some of the books and essays that he had written, and before long, we realized we had stumbled on dynamite in the most real sense. So just a quick summary before we even get into what Robert Owen believed. The public school system that exists today was born in Robert Owen's mind, right? It's no overstatement to say he really was the intellectual godfather of what became the public school system that we have today. And that's not to say that other men weren't influential in its development. They certainly were, and we talk about them in the book, Horace Mann, John Dewey, and many others. But Robert Owen was the first guy to really think this through. We've got to have the government take over education so that we can use the education system to prepare these children for life in a world without private property, without marriage and family, and certainly without Christianity, what he called irrational systems of religion. And so as we looked into this guy, it just kept getting darker and darker. So one of the things that he did to advance this idea of a government takeover of education was to start a secret society. It's like a bad movie, but it's real. And so we have texts from one of the guys who was involved in this secret society. His name was Orestes Brownson. He eventually became a Roman Catholic and really was horrified by this whole idea that he had been so active in. He talks about how he had been organizing the state of New York for this secret society. And he says the great object of this whole plan was to get rid of Christianity, right? That was the point of it wasn't a bug in the system. It was a feature. It was the raison d'etre for the whole system that they were trying to spread across the United States and eventually the world. And it gets crazier, believe it or not. And long story short, this ends up being implemented in Prussia. And Robert Owen talks about this in his autobiography. He says that the Prussian dictator, who got copies of his essays through Baron Jacobi, the Prussian ambassador, he says was so much approved of these ideas on education that he ordered them implemented in Prussia and really weaponized this kind of burgeoning system of education to really become the first ever example of education of the state, by the state, and for the state. And then we found another document. And so right before he died, Robert Owen convened a conference. He called it the Congress of the Advanced Minds of the World. Obviously, a very humble guy. So he thought he was one of the advanced minds of the world, of course, and we are all the suckers who are still trapped in irrational systems of religion with our quaint ideas of family and private property. And then he lets the cat out of the bag about where he's getting all these ideas. A fascinating story. Long story short, and I've got the essays. We quote them extensively in chapter 1. he's communicating with what he thinks are the spirits of dead people. And he talks about this. He's using Ouija boards, and they're tapping on doors and furniture and walls. So he's communicating with spiritual entities. Of course, we as Christians who read our Bible, you just read Leviticus, read Deuteronomy. I mean, this is clearly prohibited by God. If he calls it an abomination, he puts it in the same category as sacrificing your children to demons. Obviously not a good idea. But he's proud of the fact that these spirits he's talking to are giving him profound insights into how we're going to improve the race, how we're going to take the world into this glorious new future. And so for pastors out there who think like, oh, no, it's just I say potato, you say potato, I homeschool, I do Christian school, you do government school. No. The guy who came up with the idea was talking to demons. Like, I wish I were making it up, but the evidence is all there. You can read the essays and the speeches for yourself. We're not lying. It's all there, plain English, smoking gun evidence. This is not something that Christians should be participating in.
No, and a lot of people said, well, it didn't get bad right away. We used to have prayer and all these other things in it, but it takes time. Like, God did say there'd be generational blessings if you did things the right way, but eventually those run out. And I think we really have run out of it. And look, Barna says, I don't remember the exact, 83% of kids who are raised in Christian kids but go to public school walk away from the faith. 6% of young people, or 6% of everyone, has a biblical worldview, and like for Gen Z, it's like 2%. So, I mean, yes, very clearly, Robert Owen and Karl Marx, those ideas won, and we've got to win them back. So, one of the things that people say to us all the time, Alex, and we address this in chapter 4, is that, well, this would never work, or, you got to have the government involved, for XYZ reason. But America actually was founded with basically no public education. It was all found privately funded for the most part. So in chapter 4, we say, in 1812, Dupont de Nemours released his study, The National Education in the United States of America. And his findings were astounding. Most young Americans, therefore, can read, write, and cipher, which means math, for all of us who've been educated here in the last 20 years. He said no more than 4 in 1,000 are unable to write legibly, even neatly. And of course, today it's something like, I don't know how many kids can even handwrite anymore. People are just told, make your mark, which was like the thing they told slaves back in the day whenever you watch any of these old movies. So is our ideas really that radical, or have they been implemented before in society here in the United States?
That for me is another one of the most amazing insights in the book, and just that people can glean. They act, the people who argue against us act like we'd be engaging in this unprecedented experiment. Like, if the government didn't run education, what would we do? Who knows? Well, we do know, because that's basically the story of American history. You look back, and we were the best educated society in the history of humanity. We were far better educated than we are today. In fact, early on in the book, you, I think, very wisely included an old test that people used to use back, 100 and something years ago. And that's what our great-great-grandparents were doing. They were way smarter than us. So we have not gotten better educated as a result of government education. And Dupont de Nemours' study, National Education in the United States of America, he was buddy with Thomas Jefferson. That gives you some real insight into what American education looked like. And starting with the fact that they used to call it cipher. Now, as our friend Sam Sorbo, who very generously wrote a nice endorsement for our book, says, everything about government school is a lie. They talk about the 3 R's. Arithmetic doesn't start with an R. So yes, it's ciphering. But Americans were very, very well educated, and we didn't have government schools back then. Government didn't even get its camel's nose under the tent until starting around the mid-1800s in Massachusetts. Before that, you mostly had homeschooling, and you had private Christian schools. And that's not to say that poor people couldn't get an education. Most of the denominations would happily take the children of poor parents if the parents couldn't afford it. And most of the poor parents were doing a much better job educating their children at home than the government indoctrination camps are doing today. So it's really a silly argument. But I think that's one of the most important things that people will get from this book is that this isn't an experiment. We had an incredible education non-system before the government got its grimy mitts all over it. And we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We can go back to what worked. I actually spent some time digging into what did that education look like? Well, it was classical, right? They taught the trivium. They were focused heavily on scripture. They did a lot of memorization, yet they learned Latin and they learned Greek. And I mean, it's just incredible what our forefathers understood. And when you compare that to where we are today, it makes you want to cry, but it doesn't have to be the end of the story. We don't have to let this be the end. We can go back to what worked and resurrect it, if you will, so that we can once again have a highly literate, well-informed, moral society without any government role for education whatsoever.
Wokeandweaponized.com. Go there right now and get my new book. It outlines the history of American education and why the current public school system can't be reformed. It must be replaced. And this is a well-documented book. Thank you, Dr. Benjamin Merkle, for writing the foreword. And as Sean Ryan said, if you're a parent, read this book. Go to wokeandweaponized.com today. Yeah, I like to say that your great-grandma's 8th grade education was harder than your master's degree. And so
absolutely.
You take a look at that, and it's just like this mind-boggling thing. So Robert Owen, no one's ever heard of him. How did he get his ideas around? And of course, we're all familiar in the United States with U.S. aid and how kind of the left wing had weaponized that to kind of finance their own worldview, not just here in the United States, but around the world at our $38 trillion national debt expense. But this isn't new. This was something that surprised me. So we talk about this in chapter 8. In the early 1950s, growing unease about subversive infiltration into American institutions prompted Congress to act. The House Select Committee to investigate tax-exempt foundations and comparable organizations, better known as the Reese Committee, was formed in 1953. Its directive was unambiguous: examine whether nonprofit foundations were deploying taxpayer-exempt resources to push collective or communist agendas. So tell us, what is the Reese Committee, and are they running the 1950s playbook today?
They absolutely are running the 1950s playbook today, only it's far worse than it was in the 1950s. But even back in the 1950s, this is so interesting. I read most of the Reese report. It's a long and somewhat tedious read. But one of the things that they conclude in there is that there had been a revolution in the United States of America. And they talk about the revolution as being in the past tense, right? We think the revolution is coming. They said, no, the revolution already happened. They're writing this in the late 1940s, early 1950s is when they're the time period that they're really focused on. And they said this revolution never could have succeeded without violence unless education had prepared the way in advance. And so, we still think that the revolution is coming. The revolution already happened. Now, there's different stages in the revolution. We're still going through that. But the shift in Americans' attitudes and worldview and the political systems, that began long ago. And yes, there was a bunch of commies involved in this. I mean, John Dewey is really the perfect example. But commies don't usually produce a lot of wealth. So they had allies. And you go back all the way to John Dewey, who was one of the main players in the creation of this system that we have today. He teamed up with the Rockefellers, the Rockefeller Foundation that was called the General Education Board, late 1800s, early 1900s. They're pumping huge amounts of money, millions of dollars into John Dewey's operation. Now, Rockefeller was the wealthiest capitalist that the world had ever seen. This guy had money coming out of his ears. He was ruthless in business, shut down his competitors, whatever he had to do. This guy had so much money he could never spend it in 10 lifetimes. And a lot of it he plowed into education. And the guy he put in charge of his operation, Frederick Gates, unbelievably said the quiet part out loud. He said, look, we don't need to train up, artists and lawyers and politicians and statesmen. And, we need workers. We need workers. Right? And so the education needs to be focused on creating workers for us. He wanted complacent, unthinking worker drones to sit in the factory and turn the screwdriver when the widget came across, and not think about the important things in life, not think about politics, not think about whether this was a reasonable system. And so he teamed up with John Dewey, the guy who loved the Soviet Union, and throughout the coming decades, right, from the early 1900s all the way up until when the Reese Committee put together this report, the Rockefeller Foundation, along with Carnegie and Ford and some of the others, basically took charge of our educational system. Carnegie focused a lot on the international front. Rockefeller focused a lot on the domestic front. But together, they completely transformed what we understood to be education. And they did, just as the Reese Committee said, unleash a revolution in this country. And as you read this Reese and Cox Committee reports, they talk about the ideology that these evildoers promoted as collectivism, yes, which is another word for like communism, right? Suppress the individual for the good of the collective. But also they talk about it as oligarchical collectivism, which is a term I had never heard until this report. And it means just what it sounds like. Collectivism, like communism, where the interests and the rights of the individual are subordinated to the interests and the rights of the group. And also all ruled by an oligarchy. That's where the oligarchical comes in. So you've got Rockefellers and the robber barons basically teaming up with a bunch of commies to dumb down the population of the United States, completely shift our worldview. And this is atrocious. And so you don't even have to be like a right-wing conservative Christian to say, wait a minute, do we really need robber barons determining what our children are going to learn? So this is a crazy story. It doesn't matter where you are on the political spectrum. This should outrage you that a bunch of uber wealthy elites decided that they were going to dumb down your kids.
It should outrage you. So I'm sure that the elected officials at the time read this report and did something about it.
No, of course not, right? They did their best to suppress this. We definitely don't want anybody to hear about this. And so very few people are even aware that this committee put out this report. It wasn't widely reported in the media because, of course, the robber barons it was exposing already had enormous influence in the media. But the chief investigator for this, he never let it die. His name was Norman Dodd. And he did an astounding interview shortly before he died, actually, with a friend of mine, G. Edward Griffin. And he says, people can find this interview. It will be an hour of your life that will be very well spent. It'll blow you away. And he says that the head of the Ford Foundation, Alan Geithner, calls him into his office right after this select committee is formed. And he says, look, what are you doing investigating? I'll tell you what we're doing, all right? It's not a big secret. Just come on. So he says, what we're doing is we're working with the White House to use our grant-making ability to so alter life in the United States that we could be comfortably merged with the Soviet Union. I mean, that right there should have been all anybody needed to know. Okay, you're working to transform our country so we could be merged with a murderous communist system that has not just destroyed wealth, but destroyed tens of millions of human lives? These people ought to be in jail or a rubber room. Instead, they're educating your children.
Yeah, and that playbook has continued down the road. I mean, first of all, the Rockefeller Foundation, I think, still involved. And one of the interesting things, and we cover in Chapter 9, a number of billionaires who are kind of in this oligarchy of robber barons in many ways. And many of them have pledged to give away their money before they die. And it's a very utopian, feel-good thing. And many of them, like you said, don't have enough money, have so much money they can't spend it all anyway, so they're giving it away. And a lot of it is in education, and a lot of it is in school choice. So not related as far as I'm aware of, but the Bill Gates Foundation is one of those that is behind the school choice push. This is what Bill Gates said in 2010. I really think that charters have the potential to revolutionize the way students are educated. And in 2017, the Gates Foundation pledged $1.7 billion for education over 5 years, with 15% or $255 million going to charter schools. So that begs the question, where did the other 85% or $1.4 billion go to? So as you were researching it, like school choice has been this kind of push on the right since COVID. But what does the research say on some of the groups actually funding it?
This was so interesting to me, Robert, because you're right. A lot of people associate school choice with kind of the right or conservatives or even libertarians. And it's true. There are some right wingers and libertarians that are pushing this. But what was really interesting to me is how many on the left were pushing this too. And one day out of the blue, this was even before we started on this project, is, who are the biggest funders of school choice? I just typed it into a search engine. I can't even remember which one. And it gave me back one of those prepackaged AI responses. Bill Gates was number one. Like, wait a minute here. The same guy who's peddling climate tyranny, the same guy who's peddling COVID tyranny, the same guy who's best buds with Xi Jinping, the mass murdering dictator of communist China, is suddenly interested in my children having educational choice. The same guy who brought us Common Core to make sure nobody had any educational choice and every state would use the exact same dumbed down, idiotic, fake so-called education standards. Something didn't add up with that. So I started digging a little bit more. Sure enough, over and over again, these big-time, well-known left-wing billionaires pop up. So as we were working on this, we even commissioned some very top-notch professional researchers to help us with this, because some of it's kind of, occult and opaque. You have to kind of go behind the scenes and look through these, arcane documents and Form 990s and stuff. So we spent a lot of time on this. And what emerges is a very, very clear picture. There are powerful vested interests decisively on the left, decisively against freedom, which is what we're told the school choice is going to bring freedom, who are some of the big financiers of this. And names that everybody would know. Soros, Michael Bloomberg, the little fascist that runs Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg. They just kicked me off Facebook again. I'm sure he wants school choice and educational freedom. So these guys are pushing this, and this should cause every conservative, every Republican to say, wait a minute here. When you find yourself on the same side as some of these guys, you really have to stop and re-examine. And the evidence is overwhelming. As you said at the beginning, Robert, we've got a massive section with our sources. Nobody has to believe you or me. Anybody can just go to the index, go to the notes, look up where we got the information and check it for themselves. There is big money here, and it's not just Koch money. It's not just right-wing, conservative, libertarian money. There's big totalitarian money here, too. And I think when you combine that with what we know from the UN about how they're planning to put all education into the same system, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, so the United Nations just put out a report basically calling for the abolition of homeschooling, or at least putting so many restrictions around it that most homeschooling parents, would die under a mountain of paperwork. And so, the United Nations actually been talking about school choice for a long time. And one of the countries that first kind of dove into school choice was Sweden. And you lived there for a while, and we have a whole chapter on the country of Sweden as kind of like what happens to a country once they adopt these ideas. And if you've looked at the news at all, Sweden is a terrible mess with, illegal invaders just, sexually abusing women, creating crimes, and getting away with it because of this collectivist vision that the Swedish people have embraced. So give us just a few seconds on Sweden, because people really should go read the chapter to really understand what happened.
I really think it's essential that conservatives understand this. I was in Sweden when all this happened. I lived there for many years because my wife comes from there. And we watched it. They got all the private schools dependent on free government money, and then the trap closed. And they said, now you all have to teach what we say. So they all had to teach the government curriculum. They couldn't have Bible. They couldn't have prayer. It was essentially a trap. And I believe it was a trap from the beginning. And it is exactly what the United Nations calls for in that infamous 2022 Global Education Monitoring Report, where they're plotting on how do we take control of non-state education actors? Well, we'll give them free money. Sweden was the test case. And, when it comes to homeschooling, I watched that too. Now, the homeschooling was maybe a separate piece, but it was in the same bill where they nationalized all the private schools. You could still keep making profit. You just couldn't teach anything other than what the government wanted. But they were literally ripping homeschooled children out of the loving arms of their parents at gunpoint and putting them into foster care because of homeschooling. So, folks, let that be a warning to you. Let it be a wake-up call. They try out a lot of crazy stuff in Sweden before they bring it to California, Illinois, and then the rest of America.
Yeah, and so This is what UNESCO said, and that UNESCO is just the education arm of the United Nations. We talk about this in chapter 13, the mechanism of control from independence to dependence. And UNESCO says publicly funded education does not have to be publicly provided, but disparity in education processes, student outcomes, and teachers' working conditions should be addressed head on. So break that down for me. What does that mean that these disparities in education processes, student outcomes, and teachers' working conditions should be addressed head on?
So what UNESCO is talking about there is, and they said this very explicitly in another report, is that we need to think of education as all being part of one system. And I've written about this for many years now. The UN is bound and determined that every child is going to get a UN-approved indoctrination. And they've actually said that very explicitly. You alluded briefly to a report, Robert, that they just put out less than 2-3 months ago. It was prepared under the supervision of a North Korean communist. I wish I was kidding, but I'm not. And it calls for essentially making whatever homeschooling is still going to be allowed into government so-called education at home. You're going to have to teach the same stuff from the same materials, take the same tests. You're going to have to submit to government inspections of your home. You're going to have to teach UN-approved values. Even the education content, that's the word in the report, needs to be in line with the UN's agreements. So when you look at what the UN itself is openly saying, and they've been saying this for well over a decade very publicly. The UN Human Rights Council in 2015 passed a resolution saying that all the private schools have to be brought under the control of the government. They're not messing around. They're determined that no child anywhere is going to escape from this indoctrination. And they've said explicitly the mechanism to bring the last remaining holdouts under government control is going to be free money. And their argument is this. And again, they don't beat around the bush. They don't even sugarcoat it. They say education is the duty of the state. They said the state is the duty bearer when it comes to the provision of education, not parents, right, which is a totally unbiblical idea. And because the state is the duty bearer when it comes to education, they need to make sure that any private school that's allowed to exist teaches what the government wants. They need to make sure that any homeschooling that's allowed to continue teaches what the government wants. And they call this actually human rights, which is it actually compounds the danger, because when they talk about international human rights law, the most severe thing that you can do against international law, so-called, is violate someone's human rights. And they're making the argument here that not teaching your children what the UN wants taught is a violation of their human rights. So we'll try it the nice way by giving you free money. And if you still won't comply, watch out. You're going to have a big target on your back.
Yeah, so the state of New Jersey, I believe, is actually trying to implement some of these ideas in the next session, or at least they've kind of hinted that's what they're going to do.
They've got a bill filed to do exactly that. You'll have to teach the same government nonsense in your homeschool.
Wow. So it is coming here, whether you get the money or not, because we're just so used to the government taking care of us. And it's just this ideology that's been grown up in the United States since they took over education from cradle to grave. And so one of the things that we've been accused of on our end is that we don't, you don't understand people's positions. You don't, we've got this big monstrosity that we have to dismantle. And so one of the things I'm proud about in this book is we give a lot of different ideas at the end. Some of them you and I don't necessarily think are good long-term, but if they could be maybe implemented short-term, would work out. And I think that's one of the big differences in our book is we actually give real policy decisions and ideas to these different think tanks and policymakers. But ultimately, and we talk about this in chapter 13, but the book goes on past that, is for those committed to genuine educational freedom and the cultivation of virtue in the classical tradition, the path forward requires 1, complete rejection of all government educational funding, 2, building robust networks of truly independent schools, 3, vigorous defense of homeschooling freedoms, 4, creating apprenticeships and mentorship programs outside state systems, and 5, preserving the Western tradition of liberal arts education. And so, yeah, what are some of those things, that we should be doing that are, incremental steps? What are things that our family should be doing today so that we can make sure the communists don't finalize the takeover of America?
Well, I think it really begins with something that's going to sound very simple. It's just a shift in mindset. Stop thinking of the government as the duty bearer, as UNESCO says, for the education of your children. They're not the duty bearer. You are. God made you, mom, and you, dad, the duty bearer when it comes to the education of your children. And that has several important implications that we need to deal with. That means, one, we need to be prepared financially to take on that responsibility. And I realize that in the modern era, where the Federal Reserve is printing money faster than we can count it and injecting it into the economy, and everybody's got to work 2 jobs and all that, I realize that's not always easy. But some careful priority setting and some careful goal setting and some really not even that significant changes in lifestyle can go a long way to helping you do that. So, you've got to find a way to make it financially viable. And I can speak from experience here, because when my wife and I first moved back to the United States, I wasn't making a lot of money. I did freelance journalism for a few publications here and there, but somehow we managed to homeschool our children without the government giving us any money. Yes, we had to drive one old car. We had to live in a small house, and that's okay. What's more important than the education, the well-being, the future of your children? What's more important than following God's instructions for the education of your children? So it takes a mindset shift. It takes some prudent financial planning. You got to think about this, get together with your spouse, and then really just prepare for the fun, because home education and taking charge of this is going to be one of the greatest decisions in your life. It's going to be one of the decisions that brings you the most joy in your life. And it'll be the best possible thing, other than sharing the gospel with them, that you can do with your children and for your grandchildren and for your entire legacy on down the line. But it really begins, as simple as that sounds, with just a mindset shift. Big daddy government, big brother government is not here to educate my children. Their job is to punish evil. My job as mom or dad is to disciple and educate my children.
Amen. Yeah. Always starts with us. Let us be that shining light on the hill that is shaming the world for not following their ways, but saying God's ways are infinitely better than man's ways. And when we do things God's ways, He's always make sure that we are provided, because He's a loving Father, and He's going to make sure that we're taken care of, doing it His way and not the world's way. So, Alex, I'm super excited. The book is live. It's on Amazon.com. You can also go to Weaponized.com to read all about it. We can't have this book be successful unless you read it, unless you're giving it to your pastors. We really need every single Christian to have the scales fall off their eyes and row in the same direction in the boat if we're to save our culture, to make sure that our children's children have the same opportunities that we do. And it seems like it's slipping out of our fingers, and we've got to start doing things differently. So wokeandweaponized.com. And Alex, I'll give you the final words before I close this out.
Well, thank you very much, Robert. It's been an honor and a pleasure to be here. I do encourage people to get a copy of the book. And then don't just absorb the information. You don't want to be just informationally obese. Go out and do something with it. Share the information with others. Get active in the process. Protect your own family. And hey, we got a lot of work to do. So thank you again, Robert.
Yeah. Well, thank you all so much for tuning in to today's episode. Be sure to watch all the School Choice episodes this week as I talk with authors from Woke and Weaponized and other thought leaders. And go ahead and pick up a book. And until next time, God bless. Share this episode with a friend.
Thank you for listening to Refining Rhetoric with Robert Bortins. Want more? Make sure to subscribe so you won't miss an episode. You can also follow us on social media to continue the conversation, and visit classicalconversations.com/rhetoric to find out how you can join a local homeschool community.